Okie dokie, we are beginning. I'm going to do my stupid screen share here. Show our RJ's Evolution Hour and the patreon.com where people can become long-term patrons for the program. Please, hint, hint. I'll be putting up a plug on that a little bit later on in the show. If we can ever get to the point, and I'm a clumsy oaf on this kind of stuff, that there's background music to this, but we can't figure out how to do that easily without it roboting. So all you get to see is the cute little visual. And then I will now stop sharing. Close that now. So today's show is about an interesting subject that I was going to do last week. Bumped when a reader asked about sex, which that takes precedent over everything, don't you think? But this one was one that I thought about this, the creationist trope, use it too, which is, you know, we deal with the same set of information that the evolutionists do. We just have a different set of presumptions. We have a different worldview. We're not limited to naturalism. We're not limited to things. We can see the bigger picture, and so we can explain things like irreducible complexity and so forth and so on way better. Hi to everybody over in the corner. Hey, Cy Strike, jump on in and into the group. I think I put the inner link on there. Anyway, it's a trope that pops up a lot, and Casey Luskin has even used it, as I said, but it's also really misleadingly wrong. And in my tip work, in the Troubles in Paradise project, as I began to measure more and more of what was actually cited and discussed and what not, I could now move from just thinking, you know, are they really paying attention to all the same data, to no, they're not really paying attention to all the same data. What you get are tropes that pop up again and again and again monotonously. So everybody, if you've been in criticizing creationism for any length of time, you'll hear about the Cambrian explosion, and you'll have heard about Archaeopteryx, and there'll be complaints about Lucy. Jackson Wheat and I had to go off to dinner, but Jackson Wheat and I were just discussing an example that he had with a local creationist, and they were tossing off exactly those same tropes still today. You hear about Piltdown Man and all of that. These are the tropes that pop up, but that's not the whole data set. And I can tell you, because of the research that I did on the reptile-mammal transition, that that is just virtually invisible in the anti-evolution context. I don't have to guess at it. They're just not paying attention to it. Somebody in old Earth creationism, U. Ross has reason to believe, literally, they've never done a single posting on the reptile-mammal transition, zip, zero, nada. So that's a whole swath, 100 million years worth of fossil data and biological information that's just not on their scope. A lot of areas, now that I've been breaking down my data stream categories, I can be measuring which sections are discussed a lot and which aren't. Biological topics are the big heavy hitter. Both creationists and intelligent designers slam into those. But when you move over into cognitive literature, neuroscience, what's going on in our brains, what causes us to have moral reasoning, what do we do in self-deception and all of that, whoop, none of the anti-evolutionists pay the slightest attention to that stuff. They're 900 miles away from it. A lot of areas, when you look at cosmology, geology issues, young Earth creationists have little nodes that they cherry pick and repeat over and over and over again. In other zones, they don't pay attention to at all. So you get the Grand Canyon. In the old days, it's not so popular now, but the Lewis overthrust, that was a popular trope in creationist circles. You still get grassroots creationists waving polystrate fossils, which, if you're familiar with those are like trees that are sticking up through seemingly multiple layers and therefore had to have been formed instantaneously. Well, these tend to be in volcanic areas where there are pyroclastic flows. It can produce layer after layer. The tree drops dead, but it still stays in place, and 5, 10, 15, 20 different eruptions will happen, and it'll put up a bunch of layers on this. And this is relatively easily understandable now that we know from direct experience in Pinatubo and Mount St. Helens, which is up in my neighborhood, about exactly how this stuff goes, where they're actually being able to see the formations of these things in great detail. Let me look over here in the live stream to see what kind of comments we're getting. We're getting some side things. Beej asks, wonder if the flood caused the huge canyon on Mars. Yeah, actually, there's a little tiny subculture in the creationism literature that the signs of water flooding on Mars is actually an analog of the big flood here. And so that this therefore allows them to justify that. But of course, the stuff on Mars isn't catastrophic flooding in quite that same way too. So, and remember, we know, I grew up in a period back in the ancient days of the 1950s and 60s when catastrophism was kind of a forbidden word in geology. But in the course of the Brett's flooding and these various things that came about with abrupt climate change, where you could see that just a slight switch in salinity in the oceanic currents could suddenly flip the climate cold in like 50 years. We now know that there are all sorts of these little roller coaster blips that can take place in that, and they're catastrophic in the short term. Asteroid impacts, those are other things that are catastrophic in nature. Volcanic eruptions, Deccan traps, and things that can destabilize. So that's also in the catastrophic stuff. But it ain't the big global flood catastrophe. That's a whole new big kettle of fish. And that has much higher standards and would produce a much more distinctive layer of deposits than what we actually see. So you always want to be very careful in discussing any of these issues to make sure that you're talking about what they're not talking about, but what the science is actually doing it. Beach just says, okay, I just hurt my brain shaking my head far too hard. When somebody says, no, so Noah's Ark surfed all the way to Earth, yeah. In the wackaloon category, I'll point out that back in the 60s and 70s, Henry Morris was seriously claiming on the moon were caused by lightning bolts thrown by the archangel Michael in his battle with Satan. I'm not making this up. Needless to say, you don't get that in Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research today. They've kind of moved past that to a kind of a benign, evolved form of wackaloonery. So they have continents shuttling around at unbelievable speeds after the flood. If you look at Ken Ham's Creation Museum, they actually show a display plaque that the Rodinia supercontinent, which in standard geology is pre-Cambrian, was actually the global Earth at the time of the flood, and that the Pangaea supercontinent that we know of as the precursor period to the dinosaurs, that's actually something that occurs briefly but spectacularly, supposedly after the flood, and then shuffled around even more to make the continents as we now know them. I mean, this is just geological twaddle if you start looking at how fast everything would have to be moving and the stress fractures that would be producing and the amount of measurement that you'd be able, oh, it's just a mess. And the creationists don't even really try to document that. It's just kind of like one of their little holy grails that they want to hope for. And it's the counterpart over on the other side of that cottage industry of goalpost moving regarding the speed of light and how to account for distant starlight. So they have to kind of play around with the speed of light and cosmological constants to try to find some way for them to be old but yet young. And we're seeing them a long time ago, but we're not, because everything is recent, and it's because time and things moved, and it's just a mess. You find Setterfield and a few of these other people over in there. Heavy Hauler points up that, remember the canyons near Mount St. Helens, the creationists try to use examples of how the Grand Canyon was formed. Yeah, they're not big. And I live in the area, and our family visited Mount St. Helens frequently over the years. In fact, we drove up as soon as they had opened the roads up in July of 1980. It was the most eeriest experience I've ever seen, to drive into the blast zone and actually be able to see the thing, and all of the just creepy quiet, not a bird sound or cricket or anything, and it was very, very strange. But now virtually all of that, except the actual blast zone area that's right around the volcano, has all been naturally and artificially replanted, but a lot of just natural regrowth. And so there's trees and stuff everywhere all over the place, because nature moves really, really quickly. But the canyons they were talking about were these little small things that were being formed in the pyroclastic mud from the water outflows of river things. They form a kind of canyony thing of rivulets that come together in things, but you can do that with your garden hose in your backyard. But the point is, it doesn't stay there very big. And there's the problem, is that you can't just scale these things up willy-nilly. And you also can't explain how they become rock. None of that stuff turns into rock. It's still loose deposits, and it erodes away very, very easily. And so the creationists that try to explain Mount St. Helens as an analog for the Grand Canyon don't even try to figure out how the damn stuff turns into rock fast enough so that another flood can actually come along and cut the canyon, because the current models in young earth creationism are that the deposits are laid down in the flood that form the structure, and then it turns into rock willy-nilly, and then another lake upstream that's formed from the receding floodwaters breaks, like the Lake Missoula flooding up in my neck of the woods, and it comes down and actually carves the canyon. Does it really? How did it get to be rock so fast? We're talking about only a few years difference between them. It just doesn't work. We know what forms steep, nested, V-shaped canyons like that. And it's that you have a situation where you have an outlet for the river, and what happens is either the area that's causing the headwaters is rising, as in uplift. That's what's happening with the Colorado Plateau. It's moving upwards because of the changes in plate tectonics that's pushing that whole region up, which is why New Mexico is 5,000 foot altitude. Or you can have a situation where the outlet drops. And that's what happened in the case of the Mediterranean die-off when the Mediterranean, the Strait of Gibraltar sealed up briefly about 5 million years ago. And that meant that the relatively few rivers that were feeding into the Mediterranean weren't enough to keep it full, and it gradually dried out. And we know this because we can find salt pans and stuff that are down in the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea that can only form in drying, desiccating environments. They're not underwater. Now, when you do that, what happens is, whoop, there's what's happening with the Nile River. It is staying the same height, but the outlet is dropping because the Mediterranean Sea is dropping. And there is a Grand Canyon-sized canyon in where the Nile River is now. And they know that because when they built the Aswan High Dam, the Russians were doing seismic things to find out where to put the pilings for the damn thing, for the new dam. And they discovered that there was this gigantic buried canyon that had been silted up in the millions of years since, on which the modern Nile River runs, because it's now running slow because the Mediterranean Sea refilled when the big Gibraltar block finally broke up, and there was a spectacular influx of material. And they know that literally because it sucked in things like shrimp and stuff from the Atlantic Ocean and deposited them catastrophically, there's your catastrophe, on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, on top of all these salt pans and all this other stuff. There's a huge amount of paleontology material on there. I'll look through the little material on here. Brian Stevens points out the pyroclast from Krakatoa still being found many, many miles away. Oh yeah, and that's a small level of eruption. One of the things that was discovered examining the Krakatoa eruption is that they discovered that pyroclastic flows can move over water. And they didn't think they could do that, but apparently they were able to move like 10, 20, 50 miles away, so that they had thought a pyroclastic flow would dissipate. But it turns out it produces like a airflow nest so that it can remain as a moving mass even though it's moving over cold water. Paranor points out Atlantis was in the Mediterranean when Gibraltar opened up again and put it up underwater. Yep. I've got a bunch of stuff where I discuss Atlantis in Dynamania at #tip, and everybody by now should know my damn website and know how to get to it. Blah! So everybody can find all that stuff, and if you don't, why the hell don't you? Anyway, Atlantis, my best bet on that is still that Atlantis is the dim and distant memory of what happened with the Santorini eruption that helped destabilize the Minoans, or the Keftiu, as the Egyptians called them. And there's a lot of anal retentive, super detailed ones that just try to map Atlantis in great detail, but Plato was a secondary source relying on stuff that he'd heard from his grand uncle, who had known somebody who was the relative that was the ambassador in Egypt, that had heard stuff told to him by the priest. You know, this is like 50, 60, 70 years earlier. So he's got a very third, fourth-hand story here. But I think that the thing that we call Atlantis is what the ancients would have called the Minoans, that there was this big thalassocracy sea empire that was very distinctive. They didn't build fortified cities. This is what really strikes you about Knossos and all these other places, that the Minoans didn't put walls around their towns. Why? Because they ruled the seas. They were the ones with the super ships, and they were just better than everybody else, and they were smug bastards. And then, boy, that volcano came along and upset everything, and the Minoans never were the same again. And it took them quite a few centuries, in fact, after the eruption, to finally peter out, and the mainlanders started having more effect, the Mycenaeans and the ancestors of that bunch that eventually lead about another 500 years later or so down to what we would now call the precursors of the Athens and all that kind of stuff. It's a long, long history. Let me see now. Then Brian Stevens says Rainier, same type as Krakatoa and St. Helens, but is a bigger. Well, all of our pimple volcanoes here are those kinds of volcanoes. Mount Lassen, Shasta. The Indians have recollections of the mountains talking to one another, and these are probably tribal memories of various eruption phases that have been going on. A lot of the volcanoes, like Crater Lake and that, go back way too far, and some of the stuff is occurring long before there were any human beings living here in North America. Ev asks, are we talking about how creationists claim to use the same data and then they cite high school textbooks from 1987? And Brian's jokes, you mean 1897? Yeah, you get an awful lot of that. Kent Hovind is prone still to trot out stuff from the 1980s, and you find this a lot in lecture apologetics on material. But the amazing thing about most textbooks is that they're trying to be as accurate as they can, but they're always going to be a political process, and they're always several steps removed from the cutting edge data. So the kind of science textbooks that would have been in force when I was in high school in the late 60s would have been using material that basically dated back to the 1950s and even earlier, sort of settled science. So you didn't have stuff on plate tectonics and continental drift because that was still very controversial. And it wasn't until they started finding the actual seafloor spreading data with the banded magnetic reversals that that just caused a big sea change. So you expect textbooks to make goofs based upon the information they had at the time. It isn't that the data that they were paying with was wrong. It's that there was a new context for it. And this brings us back to the theme of the story, which is what data you pay attention to. And the neat thing about regular science is that in the end, it's got to pay attention to all the data. Snippets of the data, but the whole shebang. And what plate tectonics is a classic example in that when they realized what was going on with these moving plates, that Wegener had got it wrong. He was thinking continents are literally plowing on top of oceanic rock, when in fact it's these plates that are carrying continents along passively on top of these moving plates that are subduction zones down below. Once they understood the mechanism, then suddenly it went, duh! They could realize why there were volcanoes in certain locations in the Ring of Fire. It all made sense. You're seeing the plate boundaries. And you could see why San Francisco is earthquake prone and Los Angeles, because you've got these things moving. And then they realized how complex it was, in that what we're seeing in places are this has been going on for a really long time, and places which aren't even, but a long time ago were at a plate boundary, would be having little seeds and bits and pieces of things. It's probably the cause of the Madrid fault that moved the Mississippi River a whole chunk back in 1812 or whenever. The worst earthquake in American history was the big New Madrid quake that is not anywhere near a modern plate boundary, but it's got fissures and cracks and fiddly bits down in there that are leftovers. A lot of very complex geological regions are because they've got masses of land that's been smushed together and forming very complex things. The whole Bay Area is very complex geology because there's bits and pieces of stuff that's accumulated as islands get flammed in as the continents are moving. And the Puget Sound area is another geologically complicated area. The whole Alps is a fabulously complicated geological area that they're still working out the fiddly bits on. Everyone should remember on the Alps, when you're looking at the Alps, you are looking down at Italy. Italy is on the African plate. It's not Europe. It's part of that African plate that's pushing northward, that's pushed up the mountain ranges. And so now we know, for all practical purposes, you want to see big mountain ranges, you're seeing the crumpled rug effect of a plate collision. And that's why when India slammed into Asia and pushed up the Himalayas, there's where your mountain ranges are. Let me look over here and see what else we got going along. Yes, I agree. Paranormal plate tectonics is just cool. Hayev brings up the Yellowstone Park supervolcano. That's another fabulous example of a magma plume where they tend to remain surprisingly fixed in the deep earth. If you look at the one underneath Hawaii and the one underneath the Yellowstone, the land is moving on top of it. It's the plume that stays where it is. And that's the same thing with the one in, I think, the Seychelles Islands or whatever in the Indian Ocean, where India passed over that at the time of the dinosaurs, produced the Deccan Traps, and the volcanic deposit is still there on the one half, but the other half of it's moved with India north, and so it's the western side of India. These plumes, and it's not entirely known, at least from my reading of the literature, I don't think it's been worked out as to why these things are like a permanent blob, why they stay put. They're not being moved along. They're below where the plate movements are. So they're there producing this kind of thing that burbles up and produces a fixed thing. So you can find a series of datable eruptions in the Yellowstone volcanoes as the land moves over it. And the current caldera is the one that's parked over. Same thing as with the plates. There was a shift in the way the plates were moving a long time ago. And so there's actually, if you look at the island chain that comes out of, everything I'm doing is backwards because I'm looking at it from my brain and you're looking at it from the other direction. So I should be going the opposite way, but I'm clumsy. Anyway, there's a bend in it as you move up towards the Kuril Islands. And that's showing that there was a plate shift that was occurring quite a long time ago that's now caused those little fossil islands to be moving in a different direction than the way they are now as to where the plates are moving over that. And you can see the early range of the next island in the chain that's forming out to the to the east of the actual thing that's over the hot spot. And eventually that stuff is going to be moving on. And what we now see is the big Kilauea and all the big mountains that are there are going to erode away in the millions of years in the future to where they're just little bumps on the sea. But there will be new islands stream as the plate is moving over this hot spot. Yes, Brian says he personally thinks they're from inductive reflux heating and thus don't move unless the mag poles also shift. That could very well be the case. They could have we don't know. They may be locked in place by that dynamic. That's an interesting hypothesis. And because it's really down deep, we don't have Edgar Rice Burroughs' Pellucidar diving thing that can go down to the center of the earth that way to be able to do that. And so it all has to be done by seismic inferences and seeing how, in that respect, earthquakes are actually natural experimental things because they produce giant shock waves. And so we can see how those things move through the various things. So they always can improve their understanding of what's down below by how the earth ripples and wriggles and reacts to the various shock waves at varying frequencies, because different rocks produce different kinds of dynamics as to how fast stuff moves through them, and the temperature of stuff varies. So they can use that mathematical science stuff to interpolate what's going on in places that they can't physically get to. Well, we're at 5:23. We're almost about halfway through on here. If anybody's got questions to toss at me about the whole issue about the creationist misuse of the claim that they deal with all the data set, I'll just point out that everybody can play this game. And everybody probably has an individual interest that they really like. What you can do is really bone up on it. And then you can check to see how much of that gets discussed by creationists. Do they even mention the topic or not? And if so, what do they do? And how much of it do they take note of? How much of it is old source material? And so it doesn't matter whether it's biology or geology or astrophysics, planetary formation or anything, if you're talking young earth creationists or over in the irreducible complexity thing. I put in 2 links in the notes to the show today. One of them is a freebie, the 3 macroevolutionary episodes thing, where I went into the Cambrian explosion and birds and mammal origin. It's kind of the seed corn of what I've been doing currently. And it's still pretty accurate and up to date, even though I wrote it about 10, 12 years ago. But that's a freebie book length work that you can download and peruse at your leisure and check up on all the sources on it. And you'll see over and over and over again how anti-evolutionists, when they're trying to discuss these paleontological issues, are really far away from the data. They're not looking at it. And so I could care less about what assumptions they want to bring on the field. If they want to bring on a magic god as the designer, go ahead. Nobody's stopping you. But you got to explain the bloody data. You have to account for why we're seeing this and then this and then this. If the designer was a designer, what the hell was he doing making therapsids over and over again? Why was he designing stuff that are getting progressively more mammalian? What, was he a dunce? It's just implausible. And it doesn't matter whether you're a religious or not. It doesn't matter whether you're a young earth creationist or not. The data is still there, and you need to account for it. So the more you out there know about that data field and what creationists and intelligent designers write about it, that strengthens the argument and the defense line, because now you're not being caught blindside where somebody brings up polystrate fossils or they bring up Lucy, the Australopithecine, and you don't really know much about it, except you're going to say, well, the scientific consensus is. No, that ain't going to cut it. Not in this day and age. And we have the advantage now that everybody can gain access to most, as in like 80 or 90% of the primary source technical literature is available somewhere free. I know, because I'm a impoverished writer that don't have money to buy these things directly. So if I can't find a free PDF, I'm screwed. So I can tell you that you can find most of this information. A lot of the journals become free automatically, PNAS and others, and mostly biological stuff. But a lot of the geology, paleontology stuff actually gets ended up now posted by the authors at their academic websites or on Academia EDU and ResearchGate. They're there. And then find an area that they really know and are interested in and do the primary source work on it, so that when you defend those points, you're not defending them as a generalist, you're defending it because you've read the original stuff and you've got a confidence that you have that you wouldn't have otherwise. I'm looking over here in the comments. Hi, Ev says, if you need more evidence that creationists ignore the data, just take a look at the Dover trial. B was completely oblivious to the tons of data regarding the evolution of the immune system. Yeah, the sandbag thing they did was dump a whole stack of technical papers and books right in front of him and said, how much of that have you read? And in some respects, it was a little bit of a cheap shot. But at Behe's own writing, ta-da, source methods, you can see he doesn't pay attention to a hell of a lot. If you go and look at tip 1.7 at hashtag tip, the reference in there on that, tip 1.7, and you can find that at the main website. You can find the other one as well. So it's both at tortucan.com and tortucan.wordpress.com. I'm cold here, and I'm trying to type without making typos, because then I have to back up and correct them all. There we go. I have a whole section on Michael Behe's reference to this imipenum resistance that he brought up at the Dover trial. That was his one and only example that he brought up at the Dover trial. And he was still hawking it in his 2007 book. I call attention to all of that. And I examined in detail how he had his head up his ass on it. And everybody can go and take a look at that and make up your own minds. And shameless book plug, I go even more so in Evolution Slam Dunk, and I put a link up on that to the Amazon.com version. I went into the chloroquine case because Michael Behe, in his 2007 book, tried to jujitsu the entire reptile-mammal transition, and in fact all fossil transitions, including human evolution, off the field, because he says that supposedly you would have to have mutations to do that, millions of them, that would be beyond the pale of probability. And how did he know that? Chloroquine resistance case and the incredibly improbable mutations that were occurring. And he came up with this just ridiculous number. And I went through and looked at all of his primary sources, which weren't many, and he was just missing the data. He was misunderstanding the difference between the probability of infective resistance versus the effective mutation rate, which were not the same thing. And then subsequent work came along, which further undermined it. They literally had worked out not one, not two, but a whole slew of different natural paths that produce the various chloroquine resistance, and any one of which could occur, and probably a bunch of them had occurred because there were differences between which form was more popular in certain demes and population groups and all that. And even though he was aware of the original paper, he just never paid attention to any of its content. So in Michael Behe's case, on a subject he had brought up specifically, there is no sense whatsoever in which he was paying attention to most of the data. Point. And by the way, I learned a hell of a lot about how bacterial resistance works at the biological levels. A lot of it involves how the pores will open up, and you'll have different molecules will react with the little things that they'll produce roadblocks inside that you won't have in other cases. And in some cases, it's necessary for one mutation to occur, and then the other one changes that frequency, and so it's very intricate relationship, every one of which is perfectly natural, every one of which we can see in nature and can experimentally view them all. And literally, Behe just didn't bother to look. He's not a microbiologist. He's not a researcher in the field. He's a biochemist. And all he did was riff off these very superficial arguments and then never do any follow-up on it. So there's another example where I'm literally measuring the degree to which an anti-evolutionist is not looking at the same data and not looking at most of the data. Hi, this last time a creationist tried to tell me there was no evidence for evolution, I had to point them to the definition of evidence. That's another problem that you get into with a lot of anti-evolutionists, both young earth creationists and intelligent designers, is what exactly would they accept as evidence? That's the number 4 component of head up your assism that you find in people that believe things that aren't true, is that they really never think through what they would accept. And in fact, they won't accept. There's no, their brain seizes up. They literally can't imagine evidence that they would accept. So they find dodges and maneuvers. And in doing that, they're also not paying attention to most of the data. Hayev says that, yeah, you can't say you're looking at the same data if you're not actually looking at the data. And yeah, and that is exactly what I've been documenting in the TIP project. I'd like to keep at it. I better put up my shameless plug here. Stephen Bauman says, dissertations and theses can be a pain in the ass to get a hold of. I'm stopping in Madison, Wisconsin tomorrow to scam one that's 50 years old. It's a mixed bag. Some of them aren't, all dissertations theoretically are archivable and archived. And a lot of the ones, I pop up all the time at various universities and other things where people's theses, both masters and PhDs, pop up as PDFs and stuff on academia.edu in particular. But there are a few that, yeah, you'll find particularly older ones are tougher as nails. I operate in my own tip analysis separate from the thesis area, unless it's a cause celeb issue. So somebody like Kent Hovind writing a thesis from his Patriot University stuff, that's hilarious to read. But most of the time, I don't really pay attention to those. So let me do my little pathetic, shameless plug here. Into things again. I'll do my screen share since we're about halfway through the show. Good, my menu is still up. Yay! So now we are. There are my patrons on Patreon. You can see the www.patreon.com downward tip. Stephen, who's in the room right as we speak, thank you, sir. John and Dyer and Eatmeal and Mona and Hendrel and Jen B and Jody and Staggles and Alex Stone and Totes Rial and Paul Williams. I have to say that because of the slowness of Patreon, not much of that money is actually worked into my bank account. The GoFundMe.com is way, way, way super duper faster. I still think Patreon can work as a long-term thing for sustainers. For example, if there were 100 people on the planet who committed to $60 a year, $5 a month, and that was a sustaining thing that worked out automatically, that would be enough to put me to the point where I could comfortably buy ink regularly. That would be spectacular. I'm not at that spectacular level yet, but believe you me, everybody who's actually plunked down money to support the project in whatever capacity, I deeply appreciate it, because it's one step forward and not one step backwards. So there's my shameless plug. There's the website. Behold and partake of hashtag tip at www.tortucan.wordpress.com. I'm whooping my little thing around it as a reminder. All the links to both GoFundMe and Patreon are there. The links to all my books, both in print format and ebook, are there. And all of this stuff, it's in PDF format at that site. You can download freebie, share it, use it, tell people about it. It's all there. And everybody can ask me questions there. If you're on Twitter, you can ask me at RJ Downard on Twitter. If you want to ask a question or take me to task about some evidence or ask me to document something, just go on to wordpress.com and put in a question. I check it daily. And I will respond, and I will clarify, and I will do as need be on that. And you'll also discover that there have been creationists who made the mistake of trying to joust with me on that, and I politely explain to them, and eventually they decide that it's probably not in their best interest to keep talking with me because they can't make any headway because I know more about it than they do. Aha. Anyway, I'll stop sharing that. There was my shameless plug, and then we'll get back to our main show here. And look to see what we've got. Yes, Steve, yes, I am very thankful for you that you helped the project on there, and I could certainly use a lot more. We got one more GoFundMe person today, number 155. That's not a lot, but it's better than 154, and it's better than 0. But you only have to compare that with Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and the Discovery Institute and the thousands and thousands of people that funnel money to them constantly so that they can afford to do movies and travel around and lecture. The Institute for Creation Research, literally, I get their Acts and Facts hard copy printed every month. Free. Because I got on their mailing list. And they continue to do that. How the hell can they afford to do that? Well, they've got Scratch. And our side is way too disconnected, but we can do it on the cheap in a way. My own project is not something, I'm not trying to build an aircraft carrier. I'm doing stuff. My website is hosted for free by a friend. The same thing with the volunteer work that generated the tortucan.com mirror site of the HTMLs. The camera that I have was a gift from a dear sweet a local guy that's been in our secular groups. Jackson Wheat is the one that gave me my microphone here so that I wouldn't have to have my speakers on during the thing, and so there wouldn't be feedback on that. I am the kindness of people who have heard my work and have realized that I'm not an idiot, that I have an approach that can be useful, that I'm doing work that nobody has ever done before. All of this material that I'm talking to you about by measurement of how many sources that are being used by creationists, no one has ever done this before. This is all fresh stuff. And it's work that takes a lot to do because it involves tens of thousands of sources. It's full-time operation to keep up with the data stream, to follow up on things, to make sure that I'm pulling everything in, that I don't miss anything. And once something is brought to my attention, it gets folded into the system. So now I'm stronger. And those who have been following me on Twitter or in the various issues, Jackson Wheat can tell you about this, and Pelagia can say it too, that the methods approach works. It allows you to jumpstart past your opponents. It means that you're paying attention to the primary source data that they're not paying attention to, and that you know what they know and you know what they don't know, and you can target your discussion in a way better, in a way that we haven't been doing before if all we're stuck is up on the philosophy end. And that means you're playing assumption games. The argument that you're going after anti-evolutionists because you're going to defend methodological naturalism. Well, first come at it from the bottom and show they aren't even paying attention to the data. Then later on, you can discuss these higher level philosophical issues because you've got the grounding built. Oh, Paul brings up, yes, the Rory Emma pollen paradox. I think that refers to some supposed Precambrian pollen. I think Leonard was tossing that out, and it was, some of that was actually published in some of the actual paleontology journals way back in like the 70s and 80s, and it was partly due to the fact that pollen can get reworked into some deposits, so things can get just badly dated, and it's always dangerous if somebody is relying on material that's really old. that Andrew Snelling makes that mistake in drawing on some really old, some cases 19th century geology work, which it's not that they weren't trying to be diligent. It's that a lot of the terminology hadn't even been worked out. The term tertiary and Cretaceous and all that, they would apply it to things we wouldn't apply it to today because they didn't have as much data available. So always be very suspicious of ones that trot out stuff that's older, or you can find this out easily from a source methods direction, because when you look at the piece, you can look to see what references they cite. And if they're only citing in-house, that's a problem. If they do cite a technical journal and suddenly it's got like a 1970 date, but the paper is from the 2005, you're going, why the hell are you citing something that old? Is there no work on it since? Did they find out work on it since? And that's when you start doing the Google searching. And that's how I find out a lot of follow-up. So, and then I plug that into the tip data set and I keep an eye out. Now it's a benchmark. Now it's on my scope and I can follow it, and the argument becomes better and better and better. Because he loves Pelagi, but he doesn't like geology, so every time he mispronounces something, I make fun of him for it. Yeah, sometimes he'll confuse some of the date pronunciations. And it's map of time. There's a portable map of time thing that I did at TIP, free for everybody, that I think is kind of helpful in putting everything into perspective, because it's the entire universe on a sheet, and it's with a series of nested things that show the geologic periods and the mass extinctions and major things like the formation of plants and mammals and dinosaurs and the like, with little general arrows that give you the benchmarks of kind of where things fit in a series of nested sheets. And I like it better than the clock or the calendar or the spiral, because you can see in one fell swoop the scale proportionally in those others. Because if you put it on like a 24-hour clock, everything that's fairly recent, like the last 50 million years, just whoop, disappears. You can't show anything because the scale's all wrong. If you're going to show out to the beginning of the universe, no. Steve Bauman brings up the 1.09 billion-year-old copper harbor formation, possibly has some multicellular life forms, terrestrial deposit. Yeah, I think copper harbors popped up a little bit. The general consensus is on both genetic and paleontological grounds that the things that we're starting to see multicellular and the formation eventually of the deuterostome metazoan stuff occurs way before the Cambrian. And we know with the Ediacara biota, and I use that word rather than fauna a lot because there's still debates as to how much, are these actually animals or not? Most of them seem to be sessile, fancy word for they don't move. Rocks and Ken Ham's brain are both sessile. But you do find some indication, I think, if it's Dickinsonia or one of the other little critters from the Ediacara, there's evidence that they're movers, that they're not sessile, and that means they've got musculature in them. We can't tell a hell of a lot because there are no Lagerstätten deposits. That's a fancy word with an umlaut. We talked about this before, and I still can't remember what damn key to do that. So don't remind me. But this little fancy word, the German word Lagerstätten. There's an A umlaut down there next to the two T's. And Lagerstätte is the plural. It's a fancy word that pops up a lot. And it's a nice one for people to learn because you can use it as a shillelagh to bang over the heads of creationists on it. Because if some kinds of fossil information can only be known if you have really detailed deposit preservation. And for that, you need a Lagerstätten, and they're rare, really rare, so rare. But that's why they got a name for them, precisely because they don't occur very often. There are 3 Lagerstätten in the Cambrian, and if you get my 3 Macroevolutionary episode book for free, download it, please, 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 read it. There's a chart in there that shows the 3 Lagerstätten, Sirius Passet in Greenland, and Chengjiang in China, and the Burgess Shale in the dates on them and all that. That's kind of unusual. Most Lagerstätten, you get maybe 1 in a period. Messel, around 50 million years ago, where we got some of the earliest best bat fossils. Solnhofen, where all the Archaeopteryx fossils come from. Every single one of them. They're only known from the Solnhofen. That's the only thing that they can find that preserves things in the Shengjiang, not that, different Chinese name, the Mesozoic deposits there where the feathered theropods and that are coming up. That's, of course, Cretaceous, so that's quite a long ways later than the Jurassic. But we don't really have any Lagerstätten deposits for that Precambrian period. We've got some phosphatization things, du Chanteau, that dates back about 600 million years, if memory serves me, 600 or 700. And they can preserve little embryos of things up to about 0.5 millimeter. So they've got these little bubbly little tiny embryos, but they would need to have preserved something bigger than that to see enough cell divisions to find out what they're developing into. And it's thought that a lot of them are sponges. There may be some animals that could theoretically be the ancestors of arthropods knocking around in there. They wouldn't have looked anything conventionally bug-like. They look more like a bug larva. But eventually you get to this point as you get closer and closer to the Cambrian boundary. You find more and more trace fossils and things eventually that are burrowing. So you have animals doing animal-y things, probably annelid worms and a lot of these other things that are metazoan organisms that presumably have a homeobox genes. There's a whole set of genetic baggage that you can infer was in existence by them because there's critters running around making burrows that must be animals that are doing stuff and we don't know what they are because there's no Lagerstätten deposits to preserve themselves. We've only got the trace fossils, the wiggles in the dirt. And it'd be really wonderful if the fossil genie would be to find a new deposit like that. There might still be some buried in something that we haven't got to before, and then they finally discover it, and the light bulbs will go off, and the paleontologists will sell their grandmother to get there. But I'm not holding my breath on that. So I suspect that most of the main deposits that we're going to be looking at, you're having newer techniques. You can use X-ray technology and things to look at the deep structure of a rock deposit without having to break it apart. So they can find some things, some of the material that they've been finding on collagen fibers and stuff, and melananosomes from feather things are showing up because they just developed way better analytical techniques today than they had 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Checking the stuff over in here, Steve says to Fino that he hit the nail on the head. It's a huge sandstone deposit, but isn't very economical, unlike the underlying Nonesuch. I think of Nonesuch as the classical music record album series, so I have a completely different perspective on that. Larry Niven, Heavy Hauler says Larry Niven did a short story about that. Larry Niven's fun. Yeah, I've read some of his stuff in many, many years gone by. Hayev says that all fossils are found in one place. It's almost like a geological distribution of species that one would predict from evolution. Yeah, that's another factor that's highly relevant, is the predictive nature of things. A beautiful test case of evolution versus creationism is Antarctica. Evolutionists were looking at the critters that you could see in Australia in the Mesozoic. You could tell that there's stuff in South America, and we know from that plate tectonics that in between Australia and America was Antarctica. And Antarctica was still parked at the poles, but the planet was much warmer. And so in order for there to be Mesozoic marsupials and other early placentals, maybe a few, a handful that may have gotten there, and of course dinosaurs, a lot of dinosaurs knocking around in both of those regions earlier in the Mesozoic, that there had to be a biogeographical relationship as to how they moved back and forth to be able to produce that, and therefore they were able to predict what was alive in Antarctica. Up and find out there's all these sauropods and various kinds of plants and other kinds of stuff that were expected to be there on the evolutionary grounds. No flood geologist ever predicted a damn thing about Antarctica. Then they'll come along and take little cherry pick pieces. See, we pay attention to the same data. We cherry pick off of your work to try to find stuff that if we eliminate all the other stuff and look at it from just the right little skewed lens and put on our special polarized lenses, we'll make it fit the flood, kind of, sort of. I don't have any track record on that. Fino says, you forgot India that also wedged in somewhere in the middle. Yeah, oh yeah. In fact, a neat little thing that I discovered just recently from following up on some research, I think I may have mentioned it in an earlier show, but I'll call attention to it again because it's so much fun, is that, yeah, India was down in between South America and Antarctica, and Madagascar was down there as well. And this is part of the debate about what happened after it got squeezed out and started moving. because eventually it's clipping along northward across the Seychelles or the Reunion Island, whatever the hot spot is there, where the Deccan Traps are. But what was it doing before then? Because if you look at the geographical relationship, it isn't really moving north initially. It's moving more easterly. And I discovered that quite by accident, there was a creationist that was bringing up the Karoo deposit in South Africa, which is a big thing that leads to a lot of reptile mammal fossils. There's a whole bunch of stuff down there that's highly relevant. And it happened to bring up a particular issue, and I was Google searching, and I discovered there was a geologic deposit where the section of it was now in New Zealand, and the other half of it was in India. And it was just exactly like this Deccan Trap things, but 90 million years earlier. And when I researched about this, the eastern part of India has these old volcanic deposits that predate the Deccan Traps, and I've forgotten the name of it. But they apparently have the signature of this hot spot that is producing stuff that now most of the rest of it is down in New Zealand. So what I surmise from the geology is that out squirts India, being squeezed by these other plates, and it's moving, and eventually it hits this plate thing where the hot spot is, picks up some volcanic deposits and deflects it like a Karoom shot, and India from that point on heads northward until it slams into Asia. So that helped explain more of what the shift was going on. Where 95 million years ago it was down heading towards New Zealand, or what would eventually become parts of New Zealand, versus the things that shifted around quite a bit. It's fascinating when you go back far that to see what's fitting along in here. Anyway, Fina says the Deccan Traps is this vast volcanic area. Yes, it's a huge, massive area, than the stuff we have in the Columbia basalt, if memory serves me, on the western side of India. I think it's more down towards the southern part of India, but if you Google it, you can find out exactly where. And it's very characteristic deposits, and the other half of it is the stuff that's in the Reunion Island hotspot. I know I called attention to it in the notes, I think in Dynamania, and I may or may not have alluded to it in evolution, in the 3 macroevolutionary episodes. But it's one of these wonderful detective stories, forensically, as to how you piece these things together. Now, the other big ones, I do allude to the various volcanic eruptions in tip 1.2, which you can also find at both of the websites on mass extinctions. And so I got a bunch of technical papers that I keep up to date. And the also the Siberian Traps, which are the big one, that's the super eruption. Whoa, the Deccan Traps is small potatoes compared to the Permian mass extinction. And that one's so bad, even the insects got bothered. But it was underneath a landmass, and so it's a different dynamic than what was happening in the oceanic version. It was on kind of close to the seashore in the period, but nevertheless, it's stayed put in that big landmass that eventually becomes Siberia. The camp, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, which is where the Atlantic Ocean started opening up in the Pangaea supercontinent. And so at the time, it was completely inland and gradually pushed things open, and eventually it became an open seaway. And so most of the camp, there's bits and pieces of it in North America, and bits and pieces of it over in Europe and South in Africa, and bits and pieces of it in the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean now, but it was in the middle of the Pangaea supercontinent when it was originally starting up, and that was in the Triassic. And that was one of the causes of the Triassic max extinction. That produced a very interesting dynamic, because the Permian mass extinction produced a huge drop in oxygen levels. So that there was only, in the early Triassic, oxygen levels were only like about 12 or 15%. And so you would have been gasping for breath at elevations that would be no problem today at our 20% level. And eventually they rebounded. But anyway, I alluded to a lot of that material and on methane burps and the big climate cycles versus hothouse versus greenhouse, the role of methane eruptions. There's a whole bunch of technical material that I put up, and I've just updated that, and we'll be updating it even more recently still. But you can keep up on that. So there we go. Yeah, Fino says, so Noah invented drop bears because they fit that one pipe close to the Ararat caldera. Yeah. Mount Ararat, by the way, is a volcanic mountain. In Dynamania, let me put that up. That's another one of my chapters. That's chapter 3 of the old book. I allude to how Ararat got into the Noah story, and it's a really recent development. All that you have in the actual texts are the mountains of Ararat, which are actually basically northern India or northern Iraq and into the southern part of Turkey. And Mount Ararat, Agradabi, I think is the actual mountain name, got associated with the story only, I think, in the Middle Ages, 1200s or so. So it fits in. I discuss it in relation to the Black Sea flooding hypothesis that some of the flood story may be distantly related to the stuff that this very catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea that's been documented. There's more work that's really come along since with Ballard that came along after I wrote that chapter, but I think it still holds up fairly well. Steve says he wish he could stay, but he's got to go. Yeah, night, Steve. Thank you very much for coming in and watching the discussion. We're just about down to the end of the hour thing. Anybody got any questions for the RJ? Stump the RJ? We haven't played that in quite a while. Hopefully then I will have made the generic argument that no, creationists and intelligent design people do not pay attention to, they pay attention to little snippets of data, and then they ram it into their mythology. And that's about as far as it goes. But the moment you start reading up, even on the snippets they bring up, you'll discover that, boy, are they leaving stuff out. And I hope everybody gets evolution slam dunk, because they'll know everything you need to know about the reptile-mammal transition and every possible creationist counter-response, including Michael Denton. Ooh, Paul Skeps, who is my favorite composer? Wow, that's a really tough one, because it depends on when you ask me. But I will say ones that I never tire of listening to. And I'd have to say Mahler is at the top of the list. Boy, and I can hum him. My favorite would be the Rondo Burlesque from his 9th Symphony. And also I will occasionally put on the opening of the 10th Symphony, which is the most universe ripping apart dissonance that I've ever heard in a piece of music. It's just fabulous and intense. I like Charles Ives a lot. I love Prokofiev. There's another I have tons and tons and tons of Prokofiev. In fact, I was just talking with somebody a little bit about that. I like mostly. I love a lot of late Romantic composers. That would be the same contemporaries as Mahler. There's a lot of fun with Richard Strauss, but Sibelius, Carl Nielsen. There's another one that I really love, Carl Nielsen. So it all depends. Now you're wondering, Beethoven, of course. I adore Beethoven, and Mozart and Bach. But I have to be in kind of the right moods for them. Beethoven, I'm so ingrained on there that I can typically just hum along with a Beethoven symphony when it pops up. Beethoven is certainly the most epochal of composers. And to show you again, how I think everything chronologically, that all of the CDs you're seeing behind me is my classical music collection. And the yellow one right next to my finger there, that's Richard Strauss's Salome and Electra. So that's Richard Strauss section. And so that's how far my collection has gotten down with the late Romantics, and it's more late Romantics, and then we're into the modernists down below and above, where you can't see because of the camera. Let me see if I can tilt that up and show you. There we go, way up there. Bingo, 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 bongo. And there's the Renaissance and Baroque and classical. And there would be a whole section, I think, fingers. I think this is the Beethoven part right about in here. And I range across a broad range of interests. But all of those are filed chronologically. The birth date of the birth year of the composer. And that meant me that I could see a lot of connections that I didn't before in terms of how music related to one another, how Anton Bruckner and Mahler shouldn't really be lumped together as post-romantics, which is the way music encyclopedias did it when I was hitting the field in the 1960s and 70s. Bruckner is actually a mid-romantic composer born in the 1820s. He's a contemporary, an older contemporary of Tchaikovsky and Brahms and that bunch, not Beethoven or later Mahler. And somebody like Wagner throws you off because he's writing his incendiary music in the 1860s and 70s, but he is an early Romantic composer. He's a contemporary of Verdi and Berlioz and that bunch that are born in Chopin and that are born in the late 18th century, early 19th century, around to 1805, 10, 15, around in that period. So it gives a totally different perspective when I looked at things chronologically. How you had this big sea change in the early Romantics that were coming out of the Beethoven era, and they were all very experimental. They didn't tend to do symphonies. They wrote tone poems and all that stuff. Liszt falls into that category. And then you find the conservatives in the middle Romantics, your Brahmses and Tchaikovskys, the ones that are on the overplayed rack, but you've also got Bruckner and others that are in that middle Romantic range. And then you get the late Romantics that are picking up on that flirtation with atonality in your Mullers and Sibeliuses and Nielsen's and all that. And then, of course, the people that are born around 1874, 80s, and on the Schoenbergs and Ives and all that bunch are the ones that are blowing everything up with modernism. So anyway, there's my brief discourse on the world of music, which has nothing whatsoever to do with evolution, but I was asked a question. So let's see what we've got going on in here. That's about everything on questions. Thank you very much for watching today. I've rattled my can for the funding sites and the books, and please help if you can. I'm still way far away from crowd. Tomorrow, Michael Shermer is going to be in town giving a lecture in the EWU series down there, and I've been trying to wrangle the idea that he and I should actually chat. And I don't know whether that's going to happen. I think at the moment I'm still totally invisible. So we'll be in the physical same space, but yet I won't be able to discuss the notions of what kind of testings we might be able to do on detecting this Tortucan phenomenon and what kind of questions might be asked in MRI tests and all that, which I have some stuff I'd like to say to it. So, okay, we're shutting her down. Thank you very much. And tell everybody about the project and help if you can.